They say the lantern guides the lost, but here...
The first body I ever saw was my neighbor's. Not on the news, not through a screen. Through the kitchen window, face down in his own garden, still holding a trowel, with his wife pulling at the meat of his calf with her teeth. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, I had loaded everything I owned into a truck and driven north until the roads emptied. The pines grew so thick they swallowed the sky. My name is Elliot Voss. I was 34, a structural engineer by trade, which sounds impressive until you realize it mostly meant I spent my life designing load-bearing walls for suburban office parks nobody wanted to work in. But I understood materials. I understood weight, stress, and failure points. And when the emergency broadcast system started looping the same message for the 6th consecutive hour without a single update, I understood something else. That the structures we trusted, government, infrastructure, hospitals, supply chains, were failing at every point simultaneously. I didn't panic. That's not heroism. That's just how my brain is wired. When most people feel fear, they freeze or run. I make lists. I'd been making a particular list for 2 years, long before any of this, back when it was just a hobby that made my ex-girlfriend Dana call me paranoid. A piece of land, 40 acres, purchased outright from a timber company that had logged it a decade prior. Secondary growth pines, dense as fir. A seasonal creek. One access road, unpaved, gated. I'd camped there 11 times. I'd poured a concrete pad for a future cabin and never built it. Now I had reason to build it. I should tell you about the drive north, because that's where I first understood the scale. Interstate 93 was passable for the first 40 miles out of Concord. After that, it became a graveyard of abandoned vehicles. Some with doors hanging open, some with dark smears across the glass I chose not to examine. I took back roads, Route 118 through Dorchester, then logging trails I'd marked on a USGS topo map 2 summers prior. The truck, a 2011 Tacoma with a camper shell, carried everything. Tools, lumber, fasteners, canned goods, water filtration, a wood stove I'd bought from a retired welder in Laconia, and enough awkward hope to embarrass me now. There was a moment, just past the Hubbard Brook Valley, where I pulled over because something was wrong with the silence. No birds, not one. The pines stood rigid in dead air, and the only sound was the tick of my engine cooling. I sat there for 3 minutes, watching the tree line, my hand on the Remington 870. I'd never fired at anything alive. Nothing moved. But the absence felt purposeful, like the forest had already made a decision about what lived there now. I kept driving. The access road to my land was a mile of rutted dirt, ending at a cable gate I'd installed myself. The padlock was untouched. No tire tracks, no footprints. Just pine needles layered so thick the ground felt like carpet. I stood at the gate as the afternoon light slanted gold through the canopy and told myself this was safety. I almost believed it. That first night, I slept in the truck bed with the camper shell locked and the shotgun across my chest. Every crack of a branch brought me upright. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something that wasn't a branch. It was rhythmic, slow, a dragging sound, like someone pulling a heavy limb, the tree kind or the human kind, across the forest floor. It lasted maybe 90 seconds, then stopped. I didn't sleep again until dawn, and even then, only because my body betrayed my mind. In the morning, I found the drag marks. A furrow in the pine needles, 18 inches wide, running roughly north to south for about 30 yards before disappearing into a thicket of young balsam firs. At the end of it, pressed into a rare patch of exposed mud, was a handprint. 4 fingers and a thumb, deep enough to suggest real weight behind it. The fingers had furrowed the earth, clawing forward. There was no second handprint, just the one. And then the trail ended, as if whatever made it had stood up and walked away on legs that shouldn't have still worked. I unloaded the truck in under an hour. I needed walls. The design lived in a notebook I'd carried for 2 years. Not a fantasy. A calculated structure. 12 by 20-foot footprint, single-story post and beam frame anchored to the existing concrete pad. The pad was overkill for a cabin. I'd poured it 18 inches thick with rebar grid because the engineer in me couldn't help himself. Now, I was grateful for the paranoia. I had enough dimensional lumber for the frame and subfloor, hauled in over 3 weekend trips during the previous summer. The walls would be double-layered, exterior sheathing, a 4-inch cavity packed with rigid foam I'd stockpiled, then interior plywood. Not because of temperature, though New Hampshire winters would test that soon enough. Because of sound. I needed to muffle myself. My footsteps, my coughing, the clang of a dropped pan. Whatever those things were, whatever my neighbor's wife had become, I'd already noticed they responded to noise before anything else. The work was brutal and solitary. I had no help, no power tools. The generator was reserved for emergencies only. Everything was hand-cut, hand-fitted. Mortise and tenon joints where I could manage them, lag bolts where I couldn't. My shoulders burned by the end of the first day. My palms blistered through gloves by the second. But the frame went up in 3 days, and standing inside those bare bones, looking up through the open rafters to a sky needled with pine tops, I felt something I hadn't felt since the kitchen window. Agency. On the 4th day, while notching a rafter on the north side, I heard an engine. It was distant, maybe 2 miles south, laboring up a grade. I set down the chisel and picked up the Remington and stood in the tree line where I could watch the access road without being seen. The engine sound grew, stuttered, grew again. Then it appeared. A silver Subaru Outback, coated in road grime, moving at maybe 15 miles an hour over the ruts. It stopped at my cable gate. 2 people got out. A man in his 50s, tall, wearing a canvas jacket and a Red Sox cap. And a woman, younger, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back and a compound bow slung over one shoulder. They stood at the gate, talking in voices I couldn't hear. The man pointed at the padlock. The woman scanned the tree line, not casually, but systematically, quadrant by quadrant. She was trained, or at least practiced. Her gaze swept past my position without stopping, but her body language said she knew someone was there. I could have stayed hidden. I almost did. But the man was leaning against the car, holding his left side. And even from 60 yards, I could see the way he winced with each breath. Broken ribs, maybe, or something worse. I stepped out with the shotgun lowered but visible. "That's my gate," I said. The woman had the bow off her shoulder and an arrow nocked before I finished the sentence. Not drawn, but ready. Her eyes were flat and assessing. The man raised a hand, more to her than to me. "We're not looking for trouble," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Just looking for distance from the road." "From what's on the road?" "What's on the road?" The woman answered. "Wyndham's gone. Hillsborough, too. We came through Franklin 6 hours ago, and there were hundreds of them. Not wandering, massing, moving north together like a herd." Her name was Sable. His name was Mac. I didn't learn those names for another hour. Not until I'd unlocked the gate, let them pull the Subaru through, and relocked it behind them. Trust was a sequence of small decisions, each one irreversible. I watched Mac lower himself onto a fallen log with the careful slowness of a man managing real pain. And I watched Sable inventory their vehicle with the efficiency of someone who'd already lost supplies once and learned from it. The car held food for maybe 10 days. A medical kit, 2 gallons of water, and a bolt-action .308 rifle that Mac handled like he'd been carrying it for decades. "What are you building?" Sable asked, looking at my half-framed cabin through the trees. "A place to not die," I said. She didn't smile. "How can we help?" That question changed everything, and I didn't know it yet. Mac was a retired game warden from Grafton County. He knew the North Woods the way I knew structural loads. Intuitively, at a level deeper than thought. Within his first hour on the land, he'd identified the seasonal creek's flow pattern, located 3 natural drainage channels that would turn to mud in rain, and pointed out a ridgeline half a mile east that would give clear sight of anything approaching from the south. His ribs were cracked, not broken. He'd taken a fall down an embankment outside Franklin, while 1999 they were running from a cluster of infected that had appeared in the parking lot of a gas station. He moved stiffly but without complaint. When I offered ibuprofen, he took it with a nod that carried the weight of a man who didn't ask for things. Sable was harder to read. She'd been an ecological field researcher, the kind of person who spent months alone in remote areas counting bird populations and cataloging soil samples. The compound bow wasn't a survival affectation. She'd been a competitive archer in college and kept it up because, as she put it, ammunition runs out. Technique doesn't. She spoke in short, precise sentences and maintained a physical awareness of space that I recognized as something more than professional habit. She'd been afraid recently, and often, and had metabolized it into vigilance. The 3 of us raised the cabin walls in 2 days. What would have taken me another week alone happened with astonishing speed once Mac could hold the far end of a beam and Sable could work a level while I drove fasteners. We didn't talk much during the work. Occasional directions, confirmations. The silence between us was productive, not hostile, but it carried an unspoken negotiation. Every shared meal, every tool handed without being asked, every decision about where to position a window or hang a door was also a conversation about 1940s America, whether this arrangement was temporary or something else. On the second evening, after the exterior walls were sheathed and the roof joists were in place, we sat around a small fire, contained in a pit Mac had lined with river stones and positioned where the smoke would disperse through the canopy rather than rising in a visible column. He'd done that without asking. I was beginning to understand that Mac didn't explain himself. He simply acted on knowledge, and you either recognized its value or you didn't. "The ones in Franklin," I said. "You said they were massing." Sable stared into the fire. "It wasn't random. I've watched animal behavior for 8 years. Flocking, herding, swarming. It's usually triggered by environmental pressure or a resource signal. These were different. They weren't following food. They were following each other. Some kind of social cohesion. They're not social," Mac said. "They're dead. They're not dead. Their bodies are still functioning. Hearts still pump. Lungs still work. Something is driving motor function and group behavior. Whatever it is, it's not death. It's a hijacking." That word stayed with me. Hijacking. Not monsters, not demons, not the risen dead of any mythology. A hijacking. Something had taken the wheel of the human body and was driving it somewhere without the owner's consent. It made them more frightening, not less, because it meant the rules might change. Whatever was steering those bodies was still learning. I told them about the drag marks, the single handprint. Mac listened without expression, then said, "We should walk the perimeter tomorrow. Set markers. I want to know if anything's been through recently." "And if it has?" I asked. "Then we know which direction to watch." That night, with the fire out and the three of us in the half-finished cabin under a tarp roof, I lay awake listening to Mac's slow, pained breathing and Sable's silence, which was too perfect to be sleep. The pines creaked, the creek murmured, and somewhere, far enough away to almost be imagination, something screamed. Not an animal, not a person. Something that had been a person and no longer had the architecture for a proper scream. So the sound came out broken, wet, like a voice played backward through ruined vocal cords. Sable's hand found her bow in the dark. I heard the faintest whisper of her fingers on the riser. None of us spoke. The sound didn't repeat, but the forest's silence afterward was total, as if every living thing for a mile had pressed itself flat and stopped breathing. We walked the perimeter at dawn. Mac led, moving through the trees with a fluidity that made his cracked ribs invisible. Sable followed 10 yards back, bow strung, arrow loose in her draw hand. I brought up the rear with the Remington and a roll of fluorescent surveyor's tape. The land was roughly rectangular, bounded on the north by a granite ridgeline too steep to climb easily, on the east by a ravine choked with deadfall, on the south by the access road, and on the west by a boggy stretch where the creek widened into something that wasn't quite a pond, but wasn't passable either. Natural barriers on 3 sides. The south was the vulnerability, the road. Mac stopped at 7 points along our circuit and tied surveyor's tape at eye height. At each marker, he placed a small cairn of stones on the ground in a specific pattern. 3 stones in a triangle. "If any of these are disturbed," he said, "we'll know something came through and roughly how big it was." At the 4th marker, near the eastern ravine, Sable crouched and pointed without speaking. I moved forward and saw what she'd found. A shoe. A man's hiking boot, size 11 or 12, laces still tied, sitting upright in the pine needles as if someone had simply stepped out of it. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no drag marks. Just the boot, its leather dark with moisture, sitting alone at the edge of a ravine that dropped 40 feet into a tangle of fallen timber. Mac looked into the ravine for a long time. "Could have fallen," he said. "With one boot," Sable said. "Could have been wearing it when he fell." Boot caught on something and came off. I looked at the boot and thought about the handprints in the mud. One shoe, one hand. Pieces of a person, left behind like breadcrumbs by something that didn't understand it was leaving a trail. We completed the circuit without finding more. Back at the cabin site, Mac drew a rough map on a piece of plywood with a carpenter's pencil, marking the surveyor's tape positions, the boot location, the ridgeline, the ravine, the bog. He was building a picture, not of the land. He already held that internally, but for Sable and me, so we could see what he saw. "We're defensible here," he said. "Not safe, defensible. There's a difference. Safe means nothing gets in. Defensible means when something gets in, we have options." "Options like what?" I asked. "Like knowing which direction to run." I spent the rest of that day on the roof. Corrugated metal panels, overlapping, screwed down at every rib. The roof was the last piece of true shelter. Once it was on, the cabin became a box. Sealed, insulated, defensible. I worked fast, driven by the shoe, by the scream, by Mac's careful distinction between safety and defense. Sable spent the afternoon constructing something she called a noise perimeter. A network of fishing lines strung between trees at knee height, threaded with empty cans containing a few pebbles. Low-tech, nearly invisible, and effective. If anything walked through the tree line on the south approach, we'd hear it before we saw it. That evening, Mac cooked canned stew on the wood stove we'd installed that morning. The cabin smelled like pine sap and hot metal. We ate in the amber light of a single candle, and for a few minutes, the three of us existed in something that resembled normalcy. Then Sable said something that dissolved it. I need to tell you both something. Before Franklin, we were four. Mac set down his 1911 Colt's spoon. His face didn't change, but his stillness deepened. My research partner, Owen, was with us from the beginning. So was Mac's wife, Linda. She paused. We lost them at the same time, the gas station in Franklin. Sable, Mac said. Not a warning, a request. They need to know, Mac. He needs to know what we left behind. Mac stared at his hands. They were large, scarred, capable hands, and they were trembling slightly. Linda turned, he said, at the gas station. She'd been bitten the night before, on the forearm, while we were clearing a house for supplies. She hid it, wore long sleeves. By the time I saw the wound, the skin around it was gray, and she couldn't track my eyes anymore. He stopped. The candle flickered. Owen tried to restrain her, Sable said. He thought. We all thought. If we could just hold her, keep her still, maybe it would pass. It didn't pass. She bit him through his jacket sleeve. Mac pulled me out. We drove. And Owen? I asked, though I already knew. Still in that gas station, Mac said. Alive when we left? Probably not for long. The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges the air in a room. I understood now why Mac's ribs were cracked. Not just the embankment, but the weight of running from his own wife. I understood why Sable's vigilance was so practiced. And I understood, with a cold settling in my chest, that the question wasn't whether the infected would find us. The question was what we'd do to each other when they did. The next 9 days were construction. I narrate them briefly, not because they were unimportant, but because they contained a rhythm I need you to understand. The rhythm of building while afraid. Every hammer strike was a declaration of intent and a potential beacon. Every saw cut announced our position to anything with ears. We worked during midday, when Mac said infected movement seemed lowest based on his observations driving north. We stopped by 4 in the afternoon. After dark, we went silent. I built reinforcements, steel brackets at every joint, a bar system for the door and the 2 windows, a crawl space beneath the cabin, accessible through a hatch in the floor. The crawl space was my compromise between shelter and escape. If the cabin was breached, we could drop below, seal the hatch, and exit through a concealed opening on the north side toward the ridge. Mac built infrastructure, a rain catchment system feeding into a 50-gallon drum, a smokeless fire pit dug 3 feet down and vented through a buried stovepipe that emerged 30 yards from the cabin, dispersing heat and smoke away from our position. He constructed a small cache 200 yards west, near the bog, containing 3 days of food, water purification tablets, and a compass. If we lose the cabin, he said, we don't lose everything. Sable built intelligence. She made daily circuits of the perimeter, checking markers, noting disturbances, cataloging wildlife activity. The birds were returning. Not all species, but jays and chickadees first, which she said were bold and adaptive. Their presence meant the immediate area was relatively clear of infected. Birds don't lie, she said. If they go quiet, we pay attention. On day 5, the cans rattled. It was early afternoon, bright sun, and all 3 of us were outside. Mac was splitting wood. I was fitting the steel bar for the door. Sable was returning from a perimeter check. The sound came from the southeast approach. A faint metallic chatter that stopped, then started again, then stopped. Mac had the .308 in his hand so smoothly it seemed to materialize. I picked up the Remington. Sable moved to a position behind a thick pine where she had clear sight lines and nocked an arrow. We waited. What emerged from the tree line wasn't infected. It was a boy, 14, maybe 15, wearing a backpack that dwarfed his frame, stumbling over the fishing line and staring at the cans with total confusion. He was thin, filthy, and when he saw the three of us with weapons trained on him, he didn't run. He put his hands up and said, in a voice cracked with dehydration, "Please, I've been walking for 6 days." His name was Theo. He'd come from a group shelter in Plymouth that had been overrun. He didn't describe the overrun, and none of us asked, because his eyes already told the story. He'd walked north on logging roads, eating what he could find, sleeping in the cabs of abandoned vehicles. He was dehydrated, malnourished, and had a laceration on his left shin that was red and warm to the touch, but showed no signs of the gray discoloration Mac had described. We brought him inside. Sable cleaned and dressed the wound. Mac heated broth. I watched the tree line, because a boy walking alone for 6 days meant the things he was walking away from were 6 days closer than they'd been. Theo didn't speak much that first evening. He ate slowly, deliberately, the way someone eats when they've recently learned that food is finite. When Sable asked if anyone else from Plymouth had escaped, he shook his head once, just once. I pulled Mac aside after Theo fell asleep on a bedroll by the stove. "We're feeding 4 now," I said. "The supplies were calculated for 1. "I know. He's a kid. He can't contribute what we need." Mac looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not anger, not judgment, something older than both. "My wife and I never had children," he said. "I spent 30 years in the woods making sure people didn't die on my watch. I'm not starting a new policy now." That ended the conversation. Not because he was right in any tactical sense, but because he'd revealed the line he wouldn't cross. And I realized I didn't have one yet. That absence scared me more than the infected. Theo earned his place faster than I expected. The kid had a mechanical instinct that bordered on savant. Within 2 days, he'd repaired the hand-crank radio we'd given up on, pulling a signal from a station in Burlington, Vermont, that was still broadcasting intermittently. The broadcasts were sparse, automated, cycling through the same information. Major cities offline. Military staging areas overwhelmed. Infection vector confirmed as fluid transfer. Incubation period between 4 and 18 hours, depending on wound location and individual immune response. No cure, no vaccine. Estimated infected population in the northeastern United States, 6 to 8 million. 6 to 8 million. I let that number sit in my mind and tried to make it real. New Hampshire's population before the outbreak had been roughly 1.4 million. Even if only a fraction of the regional infected were in our state, we were outnumbered by something that didn't need to eat, didn't need to sleep, and was drawn to sound like moths to light. Theo also figured out something none of us had considered. He was sitting by the stove on his 3rd evening, turning the radio dial through static when he said, "They're louder at night." "What do you mean?" Sable asked. "The static. Listen." He turned the dial to a dead frequency. During the day, it had been clean white noise. Now, after dark, it carried a rhythmic pulse underneath. Low, irregular, organic sounding. Sable leaned in. Her face changed. "That's not electronic interference," she said. "That's biological. Something is producing a frequency." Mac crossed his arms. "The infetti, or whatever's controlling them." She looked at me. "You asked what's different about them, why they group together. Maybe this is it, a signal, a frequency they're following. Like a hive, Theo said. None of us corrected him, because the word fit too well. A hive, not individual predators hunting by instinct, but a coordinated system communicating through channels we couldn't hear without a radio tuned to the right dead frequency. The implications layered themselves in my mind like a structural load calculation. If they communicated, they could coordinate. If they coordinated, they could surround. If they could surround, our 3 defensible sides and 1 vulnerable road became a box, not a fortress. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the workbench I'd built under the north window and drew plans by candlelight. Not improvements to the cabin, escape routes. 3 different paths from the cabin to Mac's cache near the bog, each one through different terrain, because if we ever needed to run, they'd be listening for our footsteps, and we couldn't afford to be predictable. Sable sat down across from me. She'd been sleeping lightly, or not at all. "You're planning for failure," she said. "I'm planning for reality. They're not the same thing." She picked up my pencil and drew a circle around the cabin on my rough map, then a larger circle around the perimeter markers, then a third, much larger circle encompassing the entire 40 acres. "We need to think about this differently, not as a fortress, as a territory. We monitor the outer ring. If anything breaches it, we respond before it reaches the second ring. If it reaches the second ring, we respond before it reaches the third ring. We have time to prepare. The cabin is the last resort, not the first. That requires constant patrol. That requires 4 people taking shifts, which we now have." She was right. The math worked better with 4. Theo couldn't carry a weapon effectively. Not yet. But he could sit on the ridge with binoculars during daylight and cover the southern approach better than any of us from ground level. I looked at her drawing. 3 concentric circles. An early warning system built from human attention rather than technology. It was elegant, and it turned our vulnerability, limited numbers, limited firepower, into a strategy. "You're not just a bird counter, are you?" I said. "Field researchers working alone in remote areas learn to think about predators," she said. "The species doesn't matter. The principles are the same." 2 weeks after we completed the cabin, Theo came down from the ridge at a run. He was supposed to be on afternoon watch, glassing the southern tree line. Instead, he was sprinting through the pines with an expression I recognized, because I'd seen it in the mirror the morning after my neighbor's garden. The look of someone who has just seen something that rewrites their 1,000 nam tanrain, toyenden ramida. Classaisanas dastasandi when lion I was sayuida sin 1,000 nam tanrain, toyenden ramida. Classaisanas dastasandi when lion I was sayuida sin and last ida salarnar sayidan salarna suicide dadina lewe dadrimaina daima understanding of scale. "How many?" Max said before Theo reached us. I stopped counting at 40. We climbed the ridge together. Mac moved fast despite his ribs, which had healed enough to reduce his wince to a tightening around the eyes. From the ridge's eastern edge, we could see the access road and the logging trail beyond it, and past that, about a mile south through a gap in the canopy, the lower valley. They were moving through the valley, not 40. That had been what Theo could see from his initial angle. From the ridge, the true number unfolded. A column of bodies stretching south beyond our sight. threading through the trees like dark water through a crack. They moved at a steady walk, which was somehow worse than running. Running suggested urgency, reaction, something animal. Walking suggested patience, purpose. They were heading north, and their path, if it continued straight, would bring them within a quarter mile of our access road. "Are they following the trail?" I asked. Mac watched through the binoculars for a long time. "No, they're following the terrain, path of least resistance through the valley floor, but the trail parallels the valley for another 2 miles. If any of them veer east..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. We implemented Sable's concentric defense immediately. She took the outer ring, moving south through the trees to a position where she could observe the column's progress without being detected. Max stayed on the ridge with the .308 and Theo as his spotter. I returned to the cabin and began the worst task, preparing to abandon it. I packed 3 bags: food, water purification, first aid, fire starter, the hand crank radio, ammunition, 1 bag at the cabin, 1 at the cache near the bog, 1 in the crawl space beneath the floor. If we ran, from any position, a bag would be within reach. The structural engineer in me was doing what it always did, calculating load paths, failure scenarios, redundancies. But the loads were human now, and the failure wasn't a cracked beam. It was a sound at the wrong moment, a stumble, a scream. Sable returned at dusk. She moved through the trees like someone who'd learned that every broken twig was a potential death sentence. "They passed," she said. "The main column stayed in the valley, but 12 or 15 split off. They're in the woods southeast of us, maybe half a mile. Not moving with purpose. More like they lost the signal and they're wandering. Will they find us? Not if we go dark. No fire tonight. No stove. No sound. We spent that night in the sealed cabin, in perfect darkness, breathing as quietly as we could manage. 4 people in a 12 by 20 box, listening to the forest. Theo sat with his back against the wall, knees drawn up, not sleeping, not quite present. He'd gone somewhere internal, and I wondered how many times in the past weeks a child had sat in the dark, listening to things that used to be human, and tried to keep his breathing steady. Around midnight, the cans rattled. Southeast perimeter. 3 seconds of metallic chatter, then silence. Mac's hand found my arm in the dark. A squeeze. Hold. Another rattle. Closer. Southwest now. They were in the outer ring. 2 of them at least, approaching from different angles, which meant they weren't just wandering. They were reacting to something. Each other, maybe. Or to the faint signal Sable had identified on the radio. Or to us. To some trace of warmth or scent or life that we hadn't been able to mask. A third rattle. Due south. Close enough that I could hear the individual pebbles inside the can. Then a sound that I will never be able to describe accurately, because human language wasn't designed for it. A low, vibrating moan that seemed to come from the chest cavity rather than the throat, resonant enough to vibrate the air. Not a call, a broadcast. One of them, standing perhaps 50 yards from our cabin, was producing the frequency we'd heard on the radio. Sable gripped my wrist. Her fingers were cold, and her pulse was racing. And that frightened me more than the sound, because Sable's pulse didn't race. The broadcast continued for maybe 20 seconds. Then it stopped. Footsteps. Wrong, arrhythmic, like a body that remembered walking but had forgotten the precise coordination. Moved across our clearing, past the cabin. I tracked the sound from south wall to north wall, maybe 10 feet from the plywood, close enough that I could hear the wet rasp of its breathing. It stopped at the north wall. It stood there. We didn't move. We didn't breathe. 4 heartbeats in a dark box, all of them too loud. Then it moved on, north toward the ridge. The footsteps grew faint, then vanished. We stayed frozen for another hour because Mac's hand hadn't released my arm, and I trusted his judgment more than my own desperate need to believe it was over. Dawn brought the cost of the night. Theo hadn't spoken since the broadcast sound. He sat by the cold stove, wrapped in a sleeping bag, staring at the wall with an expression that wasn't fear exactly, but something adjacent. The hollow look of a young mind reaching the limit of what it could absorb. Sable sat beside him, not touching, not speaking, just present. She understood that what he needed wasn't comfort, but witness. Someone to sit with him in the knowledge of what he'd heard, and not pretend it was anything other than terrible. Mac and I checked the perimeter. The markers told the story. 3 sets of tracks through the outer ring, converging toward the cabin, then diverging north. The footprints were human in shape, but wrong in depth and distribution. Too much weight on the toes, as if they walked perpetually pitched forward. One set of prints showed a bare foot with 2 missing toes. Another showed a foot still in a shoe. A woman's running sneaker, pink and gray, size 8 or 9. I thought of someone lacing those shoes for a morning jog and felt my throat tighten. They came through and kept going, Max said. We got lucky. Lucky is the wrong word. You're right. We got quiet. That's better than luck. We reinforced. Sable's concentric rings expanded. We added a 4th ring, a series of observation points on the ridge and along the ravine edge, positions we could reach quickly and hold with sight lines. Max showed Theo how to move through the forest without sound, placing each foot deliberately, rolling from heel to toe, avoiding sticks and dry needles. Theo absorbed the instruction with the grim focus of someone learning a skill he understood was tied directly to survival. I fortified the cabin. Steel plates salvaged from the truck's camper shell bolted over the window's interior. A second bar on the door. Acoustic damping. Layers of clothing and sleeping bags hung on the interior walls to absorb sound. The cabin became darker, heavier, more like a bunker. I didn't like what it was becoming, but I liked the alternative less. On the 3rd day after the herd passed, the radio changed. The Burlington broadcast went silent mid-transmission, cutting off in the middle of a word. Evacuation routes remain limit, and was replaced by the low biological pulse we'd heard before, except now it was louder, more structured, almost rhythmic. Sable recorded it on a handheld voice recorder, playing it back at different speeds. At half speed, the pulse revealed something that made her face go pale. It's not random, she said. There's a pattern. A short pulse, a long pulse, groups of 3. It's not Morse code. The structure is wrong for human communication. But it's language, or something functioning like language. You're saying they're talking to each other, I said. I'm saying something is talking through them, using their bodies as transmitters. The sound that one made outside our wall. It wasn't a moan. It was a broadcast. It was telling the others where it was, what it had found, or hadn't found. The implications rearranged everything. Our silence wasn't just a tactic. It was a counter-frequency strategy. We were hiding not from eyes and ears, but from a network. A distributed intelligence using human bodies as nodes, mapping the landscape through sound, building a picture of where life still existed by process of elimination. They'll be back, Sable said. That thing outside our wall broadcast our location as empty. But if the network is learning, it'll send more to verify. That's what any biological system would do. Redundancy, confirmation. How long? Mac asked. I don't know. Days, weeks. But they'll come back. And next time there will be more of them, and they'll be more thorough. Mac looked at me. The question in his eyes was the one I'd been avoiding since the first night. Was the cabin a home, or was it a trap? We can't run, I said. We have shelter, water, food supply, defensive position. There's nothing out there that's better. There's nothing out there that they've already mapped, Sable countered. Right now, they know this location exists. They think it's empty. If we leave and go somewhere they haven't scanned, we start over, with less, in the open. We stay mobile, unpredictable. We die tired. The argument didn't resolve. It became a fracture that ran through the next several days, not openly, not with raised voices, but present in every decision. Max sided with neither of us, which was itself a position. He maintained the camp, checked the perimeters, trained Theo, and waited. He was, I realized, a man who'd spent his career watching nature resolve its own conflicts, and had learned that forcing a decision before its time was as dangerous as making no decision at all. Theo broke the stalemate, though not in any way he intended. On day 6 after the herd, he was on the ridge at his afternoon observation post when he spotted something through the binoculars that wasn't infected. Smoke. A thin gray thread rising from the forest, maybe 3 miles southeast, in the direction of the valley the herd had passed through. "Someone's alive down there," he said when he came to report. There was a light in his face I hadn't seen before, a desperate hope that frightened me because of how vulnerable it made him. Mac studied the smoke through the binoculars. Campfire. Small but visible. Either they don't know the risk, or they don't care. Or they're signaling, Sable said. Signaling who? Nobody answered. The question of whether to investigate consumed the evening. Theo wanted to go immediately. His argument was simple and emotional. There are people down there. We can't just watch. Sable wanted to observe for another day, determine whether the smoke was consistent, whether it attracted infected attention, whether it was genuine or a trap. I wanted to ignore it entirely, which I knew was morally indefensible but tactically sound. Mac listened to all 3 positions and then said the thing I should have said. "I'll go, alone. Tomorrow at first light. I'll observe from a distance and come back. Nobody makes contact until we know what we're dealing with." He left before dawn. We tracked his progress from the ridge for the first mile, then lost him in the canopy. Sable took over the observation post with her binoculars, and 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 her bow, and didn't come down once in 9 hours. Mac returned at dusk. He sat on the cabin floor and drank water, and didn't speak for several minutes. Then, it's a family. Man, woman, 2 little girls. They're camped in a culvert under an old logging bridge. The fire's their only heat source. They have almost nothing. Infected? Sable asked. I saw 3 wanderers in the valley about a mile south of them. Not close yet. But the smoke will pull them in eventually. We can't take in 4 more people, I said. We don't have the food. I know. So what do? Mac looked at his hands. The same hands that had trembled when he told me about Linda. We could bring them food, a few days' worth, enough to get them moving. Tell them about the ridge, the natural barriers. Help them find somewhere defensible. Or we bring them here, Theo said. We can't. Why not? Because 8 people in this cabin is a death sentence, Theo. The noise, the resources, Then build another cabin. The simplicity of it stopped me. Build another cabin. As if the answer to every impossible problem was just more carpentry. But Theo's face was earnest and fierce. And I saw in him something I'd lost without realizing it. The belief that survival meant more than a head count and a calorie calculation. I looked at Mac. He looked at Sable. She was staring at the floor, doing math in her head. We have enough food for 4 people for about 3 weeks at current rationing, she said. 8 people cuts that to under 10 days. The creek provides water. We could forage. Mac knows this forest. Pine bark, fiddleheads, brook trout if we're careful. She paused. It's possible. Barely. But if even one thing goes wrong, an injury, an infection, a siege, the margin disappears. The margin's already gone, Max said quietly. It disappeared when the world ended. Everything since then has been borrowed. I went to bed that night knowing that in the morning, Mac would go back to the culvert. And he wouldn't go alone, and he wouldn't come back alone. The decision had been made not by argument, but by the kind of people we were, or the kind of people the situation was making us become. I lay in the dark and thought about load-bearing walls, about how every structure has a maximum capacity and how exceeding it doesn't cause instant collapse. First there's a creak, then a shift, then a slow, invisible deformation that looks like stability until the moment it isn't. Their names were John and Kara, and their daughters were Lily and Rose. John was an electrician from Manchester who'd loaded his family into their car on the first day and driven until the gas ran out, then walked. Kara had been a high school biology teacher. Lily was 7. Rose was 5. They'd been in the culvert for 3 days, burning scraps of timber to stay warm. And when Mac and I appeared at the edge of their camp, Kara put herself between us and the girls with a kitchen knife in her hand, and an expression that said she would use it without hesitation. Mac raised both hands. "Game warden," he said. "Retired. We have shelter a few miles north. Walls, roof, water." Kara didn't lower the knife. "Why?" "Because I spent 30 years making sure people didn't die in these woods, and I'm not stopping now." It took John to break the standoff. He came forward, looked at Mac, looked at me, and said, "We haven't slept in 4 days. The girls haven't eaten since yesterday. If you're going to hurt us, it won't take much effort, so the knife isn't really relevant. If you're not going to hurt us, then we'd like to come with you." The walk back took 3 hours because Lily couldn't sustain a fast pace and Rose had to be carried. Mac carried her. His cracked ribs had healed enough for light work, and he held the child against his chest with an ease that told me he'd carried children before, maybe nieces, maybe the children of hikers he'd rescued, or maybe the ghost of the child he and Linda never had. Rose fell asleep on his shoulder after 10 minutes, and something in Mac's face opened like a locked door swinging inward. Back at the cabin, the practical problems materialized immediately. 8 people in a 12 by 20 space was tight but manageable for sleeping. The wood stove could heat the space adequately. But the noise floor, the ambient sound of 8 humans breathing, shifting, speaking, existing, was dramatically higher than 4. The girls were quiet, well trained by weeks of fear, but they were still children. They bumped things. They whispered. Rose had a cough that she muffled in her sleeve but couldn't suppress entirely. Sable and I built a sound-dampening inner wall on the south side of the cabin, the side facing the most likely approach. Layers of salvaged fabric between plywood sheets, creating a dead air space that absorbed vibration. John, it turned out, was more than an electrician. He'd done residential construction and understood framing at an intuitive level. Within 2 days, he and I had designed an extension, a lean-to structure on the north side of the cabin, backed against the ridge, using the existing wall as one face. It added 80 square feet and, crucially, gave the family a separate sleeping space, reducing the sound bleed between adults making tactical decisions and children trying to sleep. But it was Kara who changed the dynamic most profoundly. She was organized in a way that none of us were. Domestic logistics, rationing, scheduling, hygiene protocols. Within 3 days, she'd established a rotation for water collection, a rationing system that tracked caloric intake per person per day, and a waste management protocol that kept our biological footprint contained. She did this not by asking permission, but by simply doing it. And by the time any of us noticed, the camp was running more efficiently than it ever had. "You're good at this," I told her. "I managed a household, a classroom, and a departmental budget simultaneously for 12 years, she said. "This is just a different kind of school." The food problem remained. Mac foraged daily, returning with pine bark, wood sorrel, and occasionally brook trout from the creek. Sable hunted small game with her bow. Squirrels, a rabbit, once a grouse. It supplemented the canned goods, but didn't replace them. At current consumption, we had 17 days of food remaining. After that, we'd be dependent entirely on what the forest provided, and Mac was honest about the limits. A forest this size can support 8 people through fall. Winter will kill us unless we stockpile. It was August. We had perhaps 3 months to build a food reserve that would carry us through a New Hampshire winter. The math was brutal. The math was also the only thing keeping me sane, because as long as there was a calculation to perform, a problem to solve, a structure to design, I didn't have to sit with the other thing. Might have the growing awareness that I'd built a shelter for one and filled it with 7 others, and that every additional life was another weight on a foundation I wasn't sure could hold. "16 days after the family arrived, the network came back. It was Theo who detected it first. He was on the ridge in the early morning, glassing the southern tree line, when he noticed the birds go silent. Not gradually, simultaneously, as if someone had hit a mute switch on the forest. He came down fast. "Something's wrong," he said. The birds stopped. Sable was outside the cabin immediately, bow in hand, listening. The rest of us followed. Kara took the girls into the lean-to and drew the canvas flap. John picked up the hatchet he used for splitting kindling, the only thing close to a weapon he was comfortable with. We heard it before we saw it. Not the broadcast frequency. Something worse. Footsteps. Dozens of them, coming from the south and the east simultaneously, crashing through the underbrush with none of the caution a living creature would exercise. The noise perimeter erupted, cans rattling across the entire southern arc, a cascading alarm that told us the outer ring was breached at multiple points. "The ridge," Mac said. "Now." We moved. Sable first covering, then Theo and John carrying the emergency bags, then Kara with Rose in her arms and Lily's hand in hers, moving fast, silent, the children's faces blank with practiced terror. Mac and I brought up the rear. Halfway to the ridge, I looked back. They were in the clearing. Not 3, not 12. 30 or more, emerging from the tree line in a rough crescent, moving toward the cabin with the steady, relentless pace of floodwater. They didn't run. They walked. Their heads turned in small rhythmic movements, scanning. And several of them were producing the broadcast sound, that low, chest-borne vibration that I now understood was echolocation. They were mapping the space, pinging it with sound, listening for the echo that would tell them something alive was near. "Don't stop," Mac whispered. "Whatever happens, keep moving." We reached the ridge. The granite face was steep enough that nothing without hands and intent could climb it, and Mac had identified a route weeks earlier, a series of natural ledges that allowed us to ascend 30 feet to a shelf wide enough for all 8 of us. We climbed. Kara passed Rose up to Sable, then Lily, then pulled herself up with a strength that surprised me. John, who'd never climbed anything steeper than a ladder, managed it with raw adrenaline and Theo's hand pulling him over the final ledge. From the shelf, we could see the cabin. We could see them enter it. The door held for about 4 seconds. The bar was steel, the hinges were reinforced, but 30 bodies pressing forward with inhuman patience simply overwhelmed the frame. The door didn't break. It deformed, bending inward until the bar slipped its brackets, and then they poured in. I watched them dismantle my cabin, not with rage, with investigation. They pulled apart the sound-dampening wall. They overturned the stove. They tore the insulation from the walls in long strips. They weren't destroying. They were searching. Methodically, section by section, the way you'd search a building if you knew something was inside but couldn't find it. Sable was right. They'd come back to verify. The first broadcast had marked the location as empty, but the network had learned that empty didn't mean abandoned. We'd been there, living, breathing, generating heat and sound and scent, and the network had registered the discrepancy. So it sent a verification team, 30 strong, thorough. Lily was crying, soundless, tears running down her face, her fist pressed against her mouth. Kara held her, rocking slightly, eyes locked on the cabin below. Mac watched through the binoculars with the expressionless focus of a man cataloging information he would need later. Sable had an arrow nocked, aimed at nothing, aimed at everything. "We can't go back down there," John said. "No," I said. "We can't." Below us, one of the infected stepped out of the ruined cabin, holding something. It took me a moment to recognize it. Theo's radio. The infected turned it over in its hands with a deliberation that was unmistakably curious. Then it raised the radio to the side of its head, not to its ear, but to the bone behind its ear, and stood motionless, as if listening. Theo made a small, involuntary sound, a gasp, barely audible. But in the silence of the ridge, it carried. The infected with the radio turned its head toward us. Its face was gray, sunken, wrong in ways that defied specific description. But its eyes found the ridge, found the shelf, found us. It opened its mouth and broadcast. The sound hit us like a physical wave, not loud but penetrating, vibrating in the chest cavity, the sinuses, the teeth. Every infected in and around the cabin stopped moving, turned, and looked at the ridge. "Climb," Mac said. The ridge above the shelf steepened to near vertical, but Mac knew a route. He'd walked every foot of this land in the weeks we'd been here, and his knowledge saved us. A chimney, a vertical crack in the granite wide enough to wedge into and climb into, ran 30 feet to the ridge's top. He went first, demonstrating handholds and footholds for each of us. Sable took Rose on her back, secured with a belt. Theo climbed with Lily, the girl clinging to his shoulders with a grip that would leave bruises. Below, they reached the base of the ridge. They didn't climb well. Their coordination was wrong, limbs moving in sequences that didn't produce efficient movement. But they tried. They pressed against the rock, clawed at it, fell, tried again. Some found the lower ledges and hauled themselves up with arms that didn't tire. We reached the top. The ridge's far side sloped gradually down into a drainage that led north, away from the cabin, away from the access road, into uncharted forest. We ran, not full sprint. Rose and Lily couldn't manage that. But a sustained jog, Mac leading, picking the route with an instinct for terrain that kept us on solid ground and away from noisy deadfall. We ran for an hour. The girls were carried in shifts. Mac navigated by features I couldn't see. A distinctive boulder, a lightning-scarred pine, a subtle change in soil color. He was taking us somewhere specific, and when we arrived, I understood. It was a hunter's camp, not a cabin. A platform, elevated 8 feet on posts, with a plywood floor and a canvas roof, tucked into a dense stand of mature hemlocks. Mac had found it during his perimeter explorations and never mentioned it. He'd stocked it too. I saw canned food, a water jug, a tarp, a first aid kit. Not the main cache. This was a secondary stash, a contingency's contingency. The kind of preparation that only a man who'd spent 30 years planning for other people's emergencies would think to make. "You knew," I said. I hoped I was wrong. We climbed up. The platform was barely large enough for 8. The girls collapsed into Kara's arms. John sat with his back against a post, eyes closed, chest heaving. Theo stared south, toward the ridge we'd crossed, listening. Sable counted supplies. 4 days, she said. Maybe 5 if we drop below minimum calories. I looked at Mac. He was leaning against a hemlock, and for the first time, he looked his age. Not broken, diminished. The ribs, the running, the carrying. His body was sending invoices his will couldn't override forever. "What now?" John asked. The question sat among us like a stone dropped in still water. The cabin was gone. The perimeter was gone. The concentric rings, the noise alarms, the fortified walls, the cache near the bog. All of it behind the ridge, behind the herd, behind a network that had mapped our location and broadcast it to every node within range. "We go north," Mac said. "There's a fire tower on Mount Dune, about 9 miles from here. Stone base, steel structure, 60 feet up. No road access. Just a hiking trail that's been unmaintained for a decade. If it's still standing, it's defensible. High ground, clear sight lines, hard to reach. 9 miles with 2 small children and 5 days of food," Sable said. "Yes. Through forest that may be saturated with infected." "Yes, Mac. I know what I'm asking. I also know what staying here means. This platform is shelter, not safety. If they're mapping terrain, if Sable's right about the network expanding, then staying still is the worst thing we can do. We need to be somewhere they haven't scanned. Somewhere high, remote, and hard to reach." Sable looked at me. The argument we'd had weeks ago in the cabin, stay and defend versus move and adapt, had resolved itself without either of us winning. The cabin had made the decision for us by ceasing to exist. "North," I said. Mac nodded. Kara held her daughters. Theo stared at the darkening trees. John gripped his hatchet. We rested for 2 hours, ate cold food, and left the platform at midnight, moving north through a darkness so complete that each step was an act of faith in the man leading us, and in the forest that might, for a few more hours, choose to remain empty. The 9 miles took 2 days, not because of distance, because of what was between us and Mount Dune. The forest north of the ridge was different. Older, denser, the canopy so thick that even midday felt like a dusk. Mac moved us in intervals. 30 minutes of travel, 10 minutes of listening. The pattern was exhausting but necessary, because twice during the first day, his listening stops saved us. The first time, he raised a fist, and we froze. Through the trees, maybe 100 yards east, a single infected moved across our path, and it walked with a characteristic forward lean, head turning in those small scanning arcs. We watched it pass. It didn't detect us. We waited 15 minutes after it disappeared, then continued. The second time was worse. A group of 6 clustered in a clearing around something on the ground. I couldn't see what they were gathered over, and Max steered us west in a wide detour that added an hour to our travel. When Theo asked what they'd been doing, Max said, "Nothing we need to know about." We spent the first night in a dense thicket of young spruce, so tightly packed that we had to crawl in on hands and knees. The branches closed behind us like a curtain. Inside, it was almost warm, the spruce needles forming an insulating canopy. Lily and Rose slept immediately, their small bodies surrendering to exhaustion. The adults took turns on watch, peering through the spruce lattice at a world that had become hostile at the cellular level. During my watch, the small hours before dawn, I heard the broadcast. Distant, south, back the way we'd come. The network was still scanning the area around the cabin, still searching for us. But we were miles north now, moving through terrain they hadn't mapped. And the distance between that 100 miles north of the border was a lot less than the distance between that and the border's sound. and our spruce thicket felt like the most valuable thing I'd ever possessed. On the second day, we found the trail to Mount Dune. It was barely visible, a narrow track through the trees marked by faded orange blazes on the trunks. Mac led us up. The elevation gain was punishing. Kara carried Rose, John carried Lily. Mac carried the heaviest pack despite my objections because he was Mac and that's what Mac did. Sable ranged ahead, scouting, returning with hand signals. Clear, clear, stop, clear. We reached the fire tower at mid-afternoon. It was there, standing. A 60-foot steel structure on a stone base, the cab at the top intact, the stairs switchbacking up the frame like a metal spine. The lower 10 feet of stairs had been removed. A deliberate modification, either by the Forest Service to prevent unauthorized climbing, or by someone else who'd had the same idea as us. The gap meant nothing could reach the stairs without a ladder or a boost. Mac studied the gap. I can bridge that. He and John constructed a makeshift ladder from dead timber, strong enough to climb but light enough to pull up behind us. We ascended, one by one. The girls were lifted by arms reaching down. The packs were hauled on ropes improvised from paracord. When the last person, me, climbed up the ladder and we pulled the ladder up. I stood on the metal stairs and looked down at the forest floor 10 feet below and felt something I hadn't felt since the cable gate. A barrier between us and them. The cab was 10 feet square, glass on all 4 sides, a narrow catwalk around the exterior. The views were staggering. An unbroken sea of pine stretching in every direction, the ridge we'd crossed visible as a dark line to the south, the peaks of the White Mountains ghosting the northern horizon. Up here, the world looked almost normal. Green, vast, indifferent. You couldn't see the infection from 60 feet. You couldn't see the empty towns, the abandoned cars, the bodies in gardens. You could almost believe it hadn't happened. Almost. We settled in. The cab was tight for 8, but manageable. The glass was both advantage and vulnerability. We could see everything, but we were also visible. Mac addressed this immediately by rigging tarps over the lower portions of the glass, leaving only the upper panes clear for observation. From ground level, the cab would look dark and abandoned. From inside, we could see the forest for miles. "This is it?" Lily asked. Her first words in 2 days. Kara smoothed her daughter's hair. "This is home for now." "Is it safe?" The question moved through the group like a current. Kara looked at Mac. Mac looked at me. I looked at the steel frame, the stone base, the 10-foot gap, the 60-foot elevation. I calculated loads, stresses, failure points. I measured what I knew against what I feared. "It's defensible," I said. Lily considered this. "That's not the same as safe." "No," I said. "It's better." We lived in the fire tower for 41 days. I won't describe them all. To do so would be to pretend that survival is a narrative, when in truth, it's mostly repetition. I'll tell you what mattered. Mac built a pulley system for the water run. The nearest reliable water source was a spring 200 yards downslope. Each morning, one person descended. Ladder down, fill the jugs, ladder up. The vulnerability window was roughly 15 minutes. We rotated the duty. Even Theo took turns, though Mac always watched from the catwalk, with the .308 when the boy was on the ground. Sable established an observation protocol. Every 2 hours, a full scan of the 4 quadrants. She logged movement in a notebook. Infected sightings by direction, distance, number, and behavior. Over 41 days, the data formed a picture. The infected moved in patterns that correlated with the broadcast frequency Theo had detected. During high-frequency periods, They massed and moved directionally. During low-frequency periods, they dispersed and wandered. The frequency seemed to cycle on a roughly 72-hour rhythm, though the cycle was lengthening over time. Sable believed the network was expanding, incorporating more nodes, and the processing demands were creating lag. "It's getting smarter," she said, "but slower, like a brain that's growing but hasn't optimized its pathways yet." Kara managed our resources with a precision that bordered on artistry. She calculated that we needed roughly 14,000 calories per day for 8 people at minimal activity. Foraging, hunting, and our dwindling canned reserves provided approximately 11,000. The deficit was invisible at first. A slight looseness in clothing, a mild fatigue, but over weeks it compounded. Mac's face thinned. Theo's wrists became bony. The girls remained the best fed among us, because every adult, without discussion, shaved their own portions to maintain the children's intake. This was never spoken. It didn't need to be. John proved unexpectedly valuable. His electrical knowledge, applied with salvaged wire and components from the fire tower's defunct radio equipment, produced a functional antenna that extended our hand-crank radio's range significantly. We picked up signals from Vermont, from Maine, from a scratchy transmission that might have been Montreal. The picture that emerged was consistent. Collapse, followed by scattered survival, followed by slow attempts at communication. No one was coming to help, but people were alive, and some of them were organizing. I built. That's what I did. That's what I'd always done. I reinforced the tower's aging bolts with wire ties. I weatherproofed the cab with salvaged materials. I designed a sanitation system that kept waste contained and distant. I constructed a storage platform on the catwalk that freed interior space. I worked with my hands, and the work kept my mind in the present, away from the questions that lived in the future. How long could we hold? What happened when the food was truly gone? What happened when winter came? The answer, when it arrived, came not from the forest, but from the radio. On day 37, Theo picked up a clear signal. A human voice, calm, deliberate, broadcasting from a location that identified itself as Garrison North. It was on a lake in northern Vermont, near the Canadian border. They had walls, they said, gardens, a medical station, a solar power. They were accepting survivors who could reach them. They broadcast coordinates and a frequency for communication. The message repeated every 6 hours. We listened to it 4 times. Nobody spoke. The coordinates were roughly 110 miles west-northwest. Through forest that was almost certainly populated with infected, with 2 small children, with declining food stores, with Mac's body aging and fraying in ways he couldn't hide much longer. It could be a trap, Sable said. It could be salvation, John said. It's the only signal that's offered coordinates, Theo said. Everyone else is just talking. These people are doing something. I looked at Mac. He was studying the map he'd drawn on the plywood wall of the cab, tracing the route with his finger. 110 miles, rivers to cross, mountain passes, infected territory. 3 weeks of walking, minimum, if everything went right. Nothing's gone right since this started, I said. No, Mac said, but we're still here. On day 41, we descended the fire tower for the last time. 8 people, 3 weapons, 12 days of food, and a direction. Mac went first, Sable went last. The ladder came down behind us. We left it for whoever came next. We walked west. I'm recording this at Garrison North. We arrived 11 weeks after leaving the tower. I'll tell that story another time, or I won't. Some of it isn't mine to tell. Some of it I can't say out loud yet, without my hands shaking. 8 of us left the fire tower. 6 arrived here. Mac is not one of the 6. The cabin in the pines is gone. The fire tower still stands, as far as I know, empty on its mountain, watching the forest with glass eyes. Sometimes I think about the concrete pad, 18 inches thick, rebar grid, poured by a man who thought he was building a weekend project. It's still there, under the wreckage. Foundations usually outlast the things built on them. I'm not the same person who drove north with a truck full of lumber and a list. I'm not sure I'm a person at all, in the way I used to understand the word. I'm something that was built and destroyed and rebuilt, like every structure I've ever designed. And the version standing now carries the load of every version that failed. Theo is beside me. He's 16 now. He doesn't talk about the ridge or the broadcast or the radio. He builds things, small things. A birdhouse, a shelf, a chair with joints so clean they'd make a carpenter weep. He builds, and I understand, because building is the only language that says what survival can't. That we believe tomorrow will exist, and we intend to be ready for it. The pines are still out there. Somewhere north, in a forest that swallowed the sky, a concrete pad sits in a clearing that used to be mine. I don't think about going back. I think about what it taught me, that the last safe place is never a place. It's the moment you decide that the people beside you are worth more than the walls around you. I made that decision, and it cost me, and I'd make it again.